Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Rosie Gibbens and Holly Stevenson discuss Hans Richter's surrealist classic Dreams That Money Can Buy, a dadaist romp that doubles as who's who of the 1940s avant-garde.
Hi, my name's Rosie Gibbens and this is Holly Stevenson, and we've just watched Dreams That Money Can Buy by Hans Richter. Thank you so much, Holly, for being with me. I feel like I'm on breakfast television. This is a film about the character Joe Narcissus, who can see people's dreams and play them back to them. It's a surrealist film from the 1947, commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim. And I was invited very nicely by Tank to come and talk about it. And the reason I invited you was because I think your work feels quite surrealist inspired. And looking further into your recent works inspired by Freud's ashtray, I was thinking a lot about the unconscious and the ways that dreams represent subliminal desires. Maybe we can start by talking about what your first impressions were of the film.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me, Rosie. I hadn't actually seen this film before we watched it today, so yeah, it came as a really, really nice surprise. And I was also quite surprised that you didn't pick the film, that it's part of the Tank season dealing with colour, which we'll get on to, I'm sure, shortly, but particularly the sequence with the mannequins, I felt was something that, you yourself could have come up with had you been living in 1947.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm imagining that they chose me because there's certainly a sense of absurdity in my practice that comes through in the film as well. Yeah. It's not only surrealist, but it's definitely got that sort of dadaist influence. Yeah, because Hans Richter was a dadaist first and foremost, I think.
Yeah. It's an absurd film. So, first impressions of the film. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it combines this kind of idea of a man who decides to become a psychoanalyst because he works out that he's got this gift of being able to see inside people. And this kind of very strong narrative sort of tops and tails the film. And yet in between we've got 6 mini films by the most brilliant selection of artists of that time.
Yes, we should mention that. So there's Max Ernst, Fernand Léger, Man Ray, Duchamp, Alexander Calder. Is that all? And
yes.
Oh, and Hans Richter, of course.
Yeah.
So each of the dreams, just to explain, each of the dreams that the main character sees within his customers, because the customers pay him for the dream, is written and directed by those individual artists.
Yeah, which is an all-stellar cast, and some of them even feature in the films. But the dreams themselves that they bring, in fact, are they called patients or?
Yeah, they are patients.
Yeah. So I mean, the first. Shall we talk about the first dream, the first patients? Is it Mr. and Mrs. A? It's like couples therapy.
Yes. So Joe Narcissus sets up his consulting room and a couple come in. Mrs. A wants Mr. A to have more ambitions within his career. Then Mrs. A is asked to leave the room, and the dream is not at all related to his career. It's related to his kind of desires for imagined, fantastical, glamorous women. Well,
basically, Mr. A is into watching pornography behind his wife's back. I think and that's the dream that. That's the dream that not only does Joe Narcissus see within him, but he certainly wants to buy. And so this film, Desire by Max Ernst, sort of sets the tone, doesn't it? Because it has a section developed to Max Ernst's own work, which would have at the time been considered pornographic. What was it called? The Robbing of the Bride. So
the painting.
Yeah, the painting features quite heavily of the chicken-headed woman who's naked, and that I thought was fascinating in and of itself, the fact that there were all these films made by the surrealists really around their work. It's a presentation of their work through this kind of narrative that Hans Richter sets for them. So I wonder which came first.
You mean the context, the framework, or the individual stories?
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that Hans Richter says that he wanted it to be a film that made surrealism kind of accessible to the general public. So I think in that case, the narrative structure is what gives some context to the individual dreams, which are obviously surreal and nonsensical in some ways. Although I found watching it that I was always trying to make conceptual sense of things and read into it kind of more logically than is actually possible. You kind of have to just let it pass over you, I think, the film, especially in the first watching.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of like this idea that it was surrealism for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. I was desperate to make sense of it, but then as I slowly eased into the idea that actually it wasn't always going to make sense. And I think, you know, the fact that they managed to get 6 films into 1 or 7 really in and of itself was like a feat.
And you know what, I think the thing about those segmented parts that just really captured my imagination is like the romanticism of the time, which I know it's easy to do in hindsight, but it just seemed like, wow, the people really were collaborating. They really did have a kind of common goal, and there was a movement, and there was like a rigorous like political inquiry going on within that artist circle. So something nostalgic about it really appealed to me too, even though I'm sure they would have been all infighting at the time. You know, it probably wasn't as easy to make as it seems.
I don't think it's pure romanticisation. I think it is. I think there must have been a political movement within them. I think there must have been lots of accordance in the sense that all of them except for Calder were immigrants to New York City. They'd all gone through the war. And then, yes, there's lots of juicy gossip involved. Like, didn't Max Ernst have to marry Peggy Guggenheim, the producer, to flee America?
So they could go to America.
Yeah.
And then I think he dumped Leonora Carrington, or maybe they decided to part ways before that.
They had to. She had to marry somebody to get to Mexico.
The Mexican person, yeah.
Yeah.
God, I just love all the gossip.
Yeah. So there must have been some like fascinating situations behind the scenes, as you said, going on. But on screen, yes, there's definitely this idea of like a harmony almost. Did you have a favourite of the films?
Yeah, I mean, I think my favourite one was Alexander Calder one, but the one that maybe feels most relevant to my work now, which as a selfish artist is what I'll talk about, is the second one, which is the Girl with the Prefabricated Heart by Fernand Léger. And that comes after the Mr. A and Mrs. A one that we just spoke about. Essentially, there's a mannequin figure. It's done in stop motion, all the mannequins become alive. And there's this kind of sing-song type soundtrack with rhyming couplets telling the story of a woman who becomes a bride, and then her suitor comes and tries to bring her gifts, and she brings all of her kind of other mannequin ladies around her. They reject him, and then they cycle away on this weird bicycle. And it kind of feels to me like there's something proto-feminist about that tableau bit. Do you know what I mean? Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It was difficult because at one level, the Girl with the Prefabricated Heart was a surrealist muse. You know, she was this mannequin that starts off broken, she reforms, but yeah, then she calls on her womenfolk to escape the mannequin man that is trying to marry her. And in my understanding was that she becomes a runaway bride.
Yeah.
And that cyclical movement of her running away was then reflected in Léger's mechanical kind of...
The cogs,
the artwork that remains on Joe Narcissus's wall the whole way through the film. And I could really see your practice in this, because it's like the bicycle that didn't work, that she's literally gyrating backwards and forwards. And then when you could see their hands manipulating the mannequins. But the music I found really compelling, and the storytelling I found compelling. And actually, that was the film that I found in some ways more contemporary than the others. I don't know.
I would agree, because it felt like that main character, the girl with the prefabricated her. It felt like she was somehow rejecting the stereotype of femininity and rejecting what was expected for her, and would definitely have been expected for her in the 40s.
Yeah.
And also, like, there's also something quite funny about it, the way that the music works. I wrote down one of the things that is said in the voiceover. It's like, her every proportion was planned. She grew up exquisitely planned. The wheels started turning inside her head after from his arms she fled.
Her every proportion was planned. She was poured from a mold exquisite and cold, and she grew up untouched by human hand. Wheels started turning inside her head, so from his ardent arms she fled. Girls of wax can't use devotion. They might melt if they felt an emotion.
And when he woos her as the healthy, there was also that emphasis on her becoming a healthy girl as well. That needs to be
healthy girl.
Exactly.
But it's interesting too, because obviously the mannequin is something that was used so much by those artists, especially by Man Ray, and sometimes in a way that feels quite uncomfortable, like those Man Ray sculptures of the mannequins with the bird cages around their heads,
where
the women feel kind of trapped in, and so often, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the film, like women for the surrealists are kind of objects to project the unconscious onto, and they become kind of passive receivers of ideas rather than having their own identities. But in that film, I felt like she did have her own agency, and it was kind of a happy ending for her.
I didn't read the happy ending, but I definitely see that she had her own agency, which did feel very much out of step with the rest of the women's bodies within the film.
Yes. So let's move on to what you kind of most resonated with. Is there a film that feels particularly relevant to your work?
I love a lot of this film because it's at its core, I think one of the core themes is this consistent desire to convey the uncanny through the animation of a body, a fragmented body, which I see a lot in your work too. I would say that the uncanny is something that's both close to us and is definitely a hot subject in this film. And I did love the calder. I did love the circus and the ballet. Although I think they're listed as circus and ballet, but actually it's the ballet and the circus. So that's the one where the grandfather, the blind grandfather and the girl come into the waiting room, not because they want a dream, but because they've got a dream to sell. So they themselves are very oniric circus type figures. And as the girl throws the ball up into the air, what should go up should come down. It doesn't. It turns into this, as you saw, this kind of like magical moment of all these kinetic calder sculptures. And yeah, I just found it really poetic. And then there was the circus. The second part is the circus film, and that was just such lovely making, although a lot of it in terms of the attitude to the wire-figured bodies and is quite wrong, I mean. So basically the blind man makes these sculptures that become very animated from wire into these circus figures, and you've got the naked strong man with his genitals hanging out wearing only a cat skin cloth and against a black background, and you've got the kind of the knife thrower, the woman, you know, having her knives thrown at her with the very jangly sort of breasts. Yeah, but they're just so fantastic. And I think it's like, you know, it's that push and pull between, I really should find this dodgy, but actually I love it.
There's so much joy in that dream. You feel like you revert to a childlike state watching it, I think.
Yeah.
Because the way, I honestly think that when things move using low-tech methods, there's something so much more like evocative. So all of the figures, they move, you can see the artist, I'm assuming it's Alexander Calder's
Must have been.
hands, but then you can see that things are attaching to each other via magnets, or he's pulling strings like on tiny pulleys, which are then making the tightrope walker walk. And there's one where there's people doing, what's it called when you swing on a...
Trapeze.
Trapeze, yeah, and they trapeze onto each other, and then it's really deadpan and slow, and like it's almost a bit shit because it almost doesn't quite work, and I think that makes it like even better.
Yeah, it's really, really, really just, there's something so joyful about it, and I think it's also a very interesting glimpse into how an artist might play in their own studio.
Yeah.
I felt that was the film that best represented an artist at play.
Because there's one bit where it's like he doesn't know what to do. A little character falls over, and then he sort of goes up, and then he just uses his fingers to do the walking.
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
I don't think that was
yeah.
planned. I think he just realised he had to get it out somehow.
And the sword eater, when he
Yeah.
plunges the sword into the mouth of this kind
But
of
he's
like...
really trying to shove it down there.
Yeah.
And the body's like bending over.
Yeah, I still believed in it. The sword eater still existed. I still believed in the actual action that was happening. Yeah, it was a brilliant insight into the way that Calder would have worked. And I believe that Calder's parents were both artists, and they didn't want him to become another poor artist. And so he was sent to learn mechanical engineering or something. Clearly didn't work. Well, it did work.
Good
Yeah.
puppets.
Yeah.
But could you talk a bit more about like the uncanny? Because I know that you know a lot about like Freudian theory. Like how does that fit into the stories, would you say?
Well, I feel that Freud would have been very, very fashionable at this time, and Freud was would have been widely read by the surrealists, and they are. So, for example, in the beginning, they mention Freud and his couch. And I feel that the Joe Narcissus, in a sense, is a parody of, well, what can I do? Oh, I know, I can't be an artist, but what do artists do? I feel like it is I'll become a psychoanalyst almost.
Yes, he almost is becoming a psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
There's that quote, isn't it? He's like, if you're an artist, you can look inside of yourself. Then you can look inside other people.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end, where I'm jumping a bit here, but where the bowl of cherries, for example, that's configured at the end, that's definitely a Freudian reference, because Freud speaks about a child that was unable to eat cherries, and so that night dreamt about the act of eating cherries. And so, yeah, I mean, what did Freud say about dreams? He said that they were the royal road to the unconscious. And I think that Joe Narcissus himself is this character that's like really introspective. He's like looking into himself. He's like falling into the pool. So, yeah, the film, without doubt, is definitely influenced by Freudian literature.
He's also kind of a parody of an artist, I think. There's definitely like a self-referential humour in the film, I think, about the state of making art in a time that had so much turmoil as well, like the role of the artist in society. I mean, because it's funny though, but Joe Narcissus is the only one that isn't an artist. He's an actor, isn't he? And they're quite different to actors. But he's kind of doing what the artists do in the narrative.
Yes, he's playing an artist.
Yeah.
Or an analyst, or
all the things.
And I think there's a lot of in-jokes for artists in it. So like when he, for example, when the blind man sells him a dream, he's like, oh, this being self-employed isn't very good, is it? It's kind of like if you have a really great show but you don't sell any work and you do a swap with your mate. It felt a bit like that.
Yeah, and there's also all these funny bits where people are trying to get Joe to like sign forms all the time, or there's the woman who comes and really wants him to sign a protest form, but he doesn't know what it's for. And at the beginning as well, there are all these bureaucrats, and he's trying to lease the room on the flat, and it feels like very overwhelming and like sort of Kafka-esque. He's like stuck within all of this paperwork, almost trying to be creative, or just trying to get by more than anything.
I think he's trying to get by, and I think that although he's the lead character in the film, and that's the narrative that's driving things, he's not somebody that draws any conclusion. He somehow is gathering this group around him, and he's looking at like artists as humans and humans as artists, and he's like articulating their concerns. I mean, and even the characters that aren't officially artists, or definitely not artists, like the banker, Mr. and Mrs. A, they quickly have to learn to articulate themselves differently if they want to have any kind of dream. I found also this sort of the slight knock at the police quite interesting. Like, I think my least favourite film was Discs by Duchamp. Yeah, it's very, very sexist. And it's sort of like a mixture between op art, a gangster film, and some kind of like, you know, obviously references the nude descending the stairs, but it's introduced, isn't it, with the gangster and the policeman, and like the you know, Joe Narcissus has just been robbed, but the policeman takes the side of the gangster.
Yeah, and the dream is the gangster. He goes into the gangster's dream, and it's basically, I mean, it's very, very abstract. It has no narrative about it at all. It's kind of moving colours and shapes, and then this repeated, nude walking down the staircase, but then that's kind of pixelated out, and then those kind of work on repeat. It kind of feels like it feels like Duchamp did the least to kind of pander to the story.
I agree. It was like he was like the least involved somehow, and he just got together with John Cage, and they were just cool doing what they were doing.
But then as well, I was thinking that Hans Richter was an experimental filmmaker as well. Like a lot of his films were more abstract, and he was a pioneer in films that had no narrative at all, and were just playing with the quality of film itself. Like cutting or burning or changing how the physical film ran. So maybe in a way that's a hint to that, a nod to that as well, like breaking down what filmmaking is, and it doesn't have to be narrative based. But I also didn't find that one as inspiring as some of the others.
No, I didn't. Yeah, it was the women continually descending the staircase and with discs on to like hide either their breasts or basically their vaginas, and it was like, well, what are the discs? Are they
not relevant at all to anything?
Yeah.
But who is buying the dreams? I'm trying to work it out, because sometimes Joe's buying the dreams, but he's also making money. So sometimes people are paying him to get a dream, right? So it's a mix. Because I'm thinking now as I speak, like how commerce is involved in the film.
Well, he starts out, doesn't he, by saying that his idea is absolutely brilliant because there are 2 billion people in the world, and
everyone's got a dream.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone will want a dream.
And then he says, "You're no longer a bum. You're an artist."
Yeah, exactly. So, but not an analyst. He's an artist. So, is it that artists are selling dreams? Is that actually the overriding statement, or is it that?
Or is it like an escapist thing?
Well, he tries to escape at the end, doesn't he? So Hans Richter, the final film is Hans Richter's conclusion to Joe's kind of wandering through this maze of art films, and he does try to escape, but quite unsuccessfully. So he's climbing that ladder, isn't he? And all the rungs are falling off. And I think it's the American flag that's being shredded, falling, cascading down on top of him. And he's like, well, forget your religion, forget your politics.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good point to talk about all the references to like war and violence in the film, because obviously the dadaists, kind of their founding principles was like the nonsense of their contemporary time with war, and trying to respond to the political situation instead of through rational mindset and logic like the politicians did and failed, to respond through kind of meaningless or absurdity, and for that to kind of be the only way we can reflect the absurdity of the situation and of the universe. So it kind of felt like a dadaist at times in the way that in the way that things basically didn't make sense or they felt arbitrary, but then there were very specific references to war and history. So, for example, in the Man Ray one, the revolvers, Roses and Ruths, or some other combination of those words. Yes. It's this very curious dream where the people go into a cinema and they watch people perform certain gestures on the screen, which they then reenact or they copy in real time. And then after they come out of the cinema, they open a book which has on it a picture of soldiers going to war, and also of Man Ray on the back of the book. And it really, the way that I kind of conceptualized that was thinking about like following orders, or somehow deciding to go along with the majority and kind of conform into something, with the gestures that they're doing. And I wonder if that reflects like the Dadaists' desire to completely reject order, rationality, and conformism by just doing things that seemed mad. Like in the Cabaret, Voltaire, and the Zurich Dadaist group and stuff.
Well, this did feel like a cabaret, didn't it, with Hans Richter or Joe Narcissus as the compere, and in terms of Man Ray had led a very complicated life. I mean, that wasn't his name. He was a Jewish emigre. He'd fled. He'd probably certainly seen his fair share of troubles, and he himself features his face features quite heavily, doesn't it? In Ruth, Rose's Revolver. Yeah, and I guess he must have been aware of all of those amazing points that you've just mentioned, like the futility of war, the absurdistness of death. That was the film that I think in many ways was quite complicated and almost a bit bitter somehow. Apparently it's one of Cronenberg's favourite films.
Really? What, that
it's listed. I think it's Cronenberg.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. There's also the bit which I find quite funny where the man's really not into it and he keeps falling asleep in the cinema, and that just made me think a lot of like performance art workshops I've done where there's some people who are like, what are we doing? Why are we copying these gestures? But anyway, that's a side note.
No. I think that's really relevant. I reckon there were people that probably just slept their way through the war. So maybe he's that figure, that disengaged figure. And I think, having a disengaged figure actually in the film would have been something relevant in the sense, I bet you they considered the amount of disengaged cinema goers. People must have left the cinema.
Watching this film?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I first watched it, I did fall asleep.
Yeah, I fell asleep too. It's so dreamy.
Yeah. And because there's no real threat, there is a bit of a threat, but not much. You kind of lose track of it and drift off.
Yeah.
And then your dream can become another dream, and then Jonas Sisters can buy the dream, and then suddenly you're in the film. Anyway.
No, definitely. I kept falling asleep after the Calder one. I found it so magical that I was like, yeah, okay, done. I found it really hard to follow on from that.
But should we come back to the flag you mentioned? Because I went on
yeah,
a bit
no,
of a side track.
not at all.
I forgot about that bit. So the flag's ripping up when he's climbing the ladder?
Yes,
yeah.
It looks like it's because it goes back to that red, yellow and blue, which is prevalent the whole way through the film.
Yes.
And maybe one of the reasons why it won an award. And there is some like moments where the colour is spectacular. And I think it is a shredding of an American flag, which would have been highly problematic as well, because you're not allowed to touch the American flag, are you?
Yeah, it's a big deal in America, isn't it?
Yeah.
To destroy it.
Yeah. So those ribbons falling, cascading on him. That's how I read it.
And everything's kind of breaking apart in that moment. Like everything he thought he understood is changing. His skin colour is changing.
Yeah, the blue man.
Yes, yeah.
He wants to be a blue man.
Yeah, and in that part where he's climbing the ladder, and so basically at the end, Joe kind of starts playing poker with these guys who come into the room, I think, and he sees he feels some water, and then he kind of goes through the water somehow, gets into this dream world, climbs a ladder, the ladder starts falling apart, then he gets into this room with a very glamorous woman who's holding some cherries. He decides not to stab her, then he eats some cherries, then he's back in his office, but everything has changed scale. And that's the end, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
He says that he believes that objects have always had a life of their own, and all the objects are condensing in around him. But there's that constant face, that big face from antiquity that might be Morpheus. I think it might be.
It's Morpheus.
Yeah, and the film ends on Morpheus being crushed, and then all of this or smashed, then all of these inky kind of colours like cascade through the screen. And I think, there's like an obvious reading of that, like goodbye antiquity, hello new world. But when I think about the date of the film, 1947, and I think about like, say, a painter like Barnett Newman, and I think like his paintings, how they must have changed in reaction to this film, if indeed he saw the film. But this use of primary colours, I think the film would have been a game changer for many, many artists from that point of view. And I think, although it's a bit literal, this sort of like smashing of antiquity and then these kind of very contemporary visuals coming through, I think they were like, I think it's relevant to talk about it. in those terms.
And then also the voiceover in that part is also reflecting on war and like how basically how we should live our lives. I think it says, the war is over, why not take a vacation? Take it easy, stop worrying, forget about your politics or your religion, which feels like it's a parody. Like I don't think that's actually what the meaning is. It's kind of like presenting a mind, criticizing or critiquing that mindset, I think.
Yeah.
Of like, you know, things do mean things.
Well, it's read out like an advert, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is the period when the ad man starts to really come into his own, like, and that's what he's going to sell you. He's selling you the Freudian dream.
That is such a good point.
Yeah.
Because also, actually, now I think about it, all the way through, it kind of feels like an advertisement. And also, none of the characters speak with their mouths. So they have completely blank faces, and the voiceover just reads out what they're thinking or saying, which I found very like disjointing in some way. It was almost like everything was like unconscious in that way.
Yeah, the tiers of recognition in terms of the interrelationship between the subconscious and the unconscious, and what you do know and what you don't know. And I think, like, even as a viewer, that's how I was left. Well, which bit did they mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I find difficult with surrealists in general, and dadaists to an extent. It's like, where's my way in to this? What can I take from it?
Yeah, what do I feel I agree with, and what do I disagree with, and like which bit actually really meant something, and to who?
Do you find that as well, because you do so much work in response to Freud? Because obviously his theories are contested and there's loads of like problematic aspects, but it's still so much at the bedrock of our culture and how we understand like art and ourselves. Is there that same feeling of like, what can I pick and choose from it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
He lived a really long life, and he contradicted himself, you know, in the sense of like he lived for a long time and he saw a lot. So what he said at the beginning and what he said at the end, you know, he revised himself. So
and that's also why you can.
And then but there are great female psychoanalysts who've since revised Freud. So it's possible to be a feminist and a Freudian.
Definitely. And also it's possible to like love all these artists even though they feel super objectifying women. Yeah,
because how they led their private lives was probably completely different. And like, you know, Peggy Guggenheim produced it and she slept with 1,000 men and no one slut-shamed her.
Did you think she had a little bit?
She must have had several tomes.
Or just a really long bedpost.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you if there's like one thing from the film that sticks in your mind or has stayed with you after watching it, or two.
I think definitely a sense of nostalgia for the idea that there was probably a golden era of art making. I felt, like you were saying earlier, I felt that really resonated. I think I felt that when I was watching this film that how it must have influenced so many filmmakers, Almodovar, like Cronenberg. Yeah, it's an interesting film. I'm gonna wait and see what it does to me, I think. But it's not something I'm gonna forget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And you?
Mine's more basic, but I really can't stop thinking about the puppet eating the sword.
Yeah. I did want to make some wire figures.
But it definitely makes me feel, yeah, exactly. Definitely makes me feel like enthused about the things that I want to make as well. And to collaborate more, I suppose.
Yeah, in that way.
Yeah, it makes me encouraged to work with people.
Yeah. And it's good that times have changed, so you can, you know, you're not going to be the woman just dragged out from under the bed. You can actually be the one making the film in this era.
Yeah, maybe that's a good point to end on.
I think so.
Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thanks, Tank. Thank you.
Thank you.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, You can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.